Wonderful. Thank you for this introduction to the ARENA and Long-Term Energy Scenario Network. I also want to extend my gratitude to your colleague, Nadim Kousous, who was instrumental in helping us shaping this forum. So before we proceed with our first session of the day, I want to test the tools with you guys. So if you could show Mentimeter on the screen. Some of you that were there last year know about these tools. It's an interactive that will allow you to ask questions and also pool during the day. So can we put Mentimeter on the screen? And while we're doing this, so just oh, thank you. On the name tag, you'll see everybody, well, most of the people in the room as color dotted. Some are to identify the EMH thematic committee members. Some are to identify the executive board and the advisory board. Some are to identify the speakers and moderators, and also the EMH team. So you feel free to ask about their role in the EMH. So this is the Mentimeter tool. So it's very easy to use. You just basically go on menti.com on your cell phone or laptop. You enter this code 1387-33484. And by the way, people online can also join and do that. So we'll do a first test just to see if you are good at this. So let me move to the first question. So where are you from? Very easy questions. You can pick from a list. And we're supposed to be seeing the live result online, so to see the spread of participants across Canada. That's always exciting. I have other questions throughout the day. So we're going to be using these tools across the day. And while we're voting, I'm going to start introducing to the stage now our moderator for our first session, Julia McNally. Julia served as the Director of Climate Action at Toronto Hydro. In her role, she led the dedicated team that assists Toronto Hydro's customers in their decarbonization effort. Additionally, Julia is a valued member of our Knowledge Mobilization Thematic Committee. Julia will be moderating our first session titled Operationalizing Decarbonization and Grid Expansion Throughout Energy Modeling. Please join me in warmly welcome Julia McNally to the stage.
Thank you, Edouard. And I'd like to welcome my panel, Alex, Conrad, and Darren. Please come on up. Thrilled to be moderating the first panel. This panel is focused on operationalizing, a word I have been practicing all weekend. I didn't know it was a word, but it's up there with many others that we create. Operationalizing decarbonization of the grid and modernization. We're going to start with Alex Prieur, Director of Renewable Integration at Canmet Varennes. Then next, Conrad Fox will speak. Conrad's a Senior Planner at the IESO. And bringing us to the close will be Darren Clark, Senior System Planning Engineer from New Brunswick Power. Edouard had promised me that we were not reading bios, so I'm a bit embarrassed mine got read. If you would like to know more about these three fabulous people, there is more information in the detailed agenda. So we're going to start 20 minutes on smart grid and then move to 2 presentations on system planning and some evolutions. And then we'll have probably about 15 minutes for Q&A. If you've got questions as the talks go on, please put them into Mentimeter and then we can pull them up as we go.
Hello, everyone. So maybe one thing to mention, NRCan, Canmet Energy is one of the research labs from NRCan. So today I was asked to talk about the International Smart Grid Action Network. So a bit less about modeling, but I will give you a perspective of the ISGAN. Sorry. Oops. Okay. Did I click twice? No. Fine. So maybe just to start, oh yeah, I clicked twice. You can go back with the red button. It's just that I don't see the same thing here. Okay, I'll look at this one. So some context of Canada Net Zero Outlook, why we're talking about smart grid. So well, I think it was clear that we need to increase our energy, pretty clear that we need also to multiply our capacity. I will insist a bit more on the capacity here since I'm talking about smart grid. The Canadian Climate Institute, if you look on the right figure here, shows an analysis of different studies that we need to multiply our capacity in Canada by 2 times or 3 times. That's pretty big. How to achieve that? And how to be maybe between a 2 or 3. So the net zero electricity, net zero economy, there's a multiple target. Every country have their own target. In Canada, it's these two, the main one. It's clear that we need electrification, we need grid expansion. They are essential to realize our carbon neutral energy framework. One thing that I think is pretty clear, and thanks to the previous presentation, Canada electricity system will be the backbone of the Canada net zero economy. I think today we can say that. But why smart grid? There's various definitions. In the past, the definition was about advanced meter infrastructure, so back in maybe 2010. Today, it's much more than that. We're talking of using the flexibility, the storage with dynamic provision. We're talking to accommodate the high VRE, variable renewable energy, that will be distributed everywhere and change the load, change the generation side according to the situation. We're talking of new market control, dynamically provisioned services, much more than just peak reduction. We're talking also of generation, new generation, that will be based on inverters. All these inverters are power electronics. They're bringing a lot of opportunity to use on the grid. And all these inverters can offer grid services, restore outage, things like that. So these smart grids are essential to maybe be more at two. So what is ISGAN, International Smart Grid Action Network, was launched in 2010. So you can imagine that discussing smart grid in 2010 was more about what is smart grid, what is not smart grid. Today we're somewhere else. At first it was a clean energy ministerial initiative, and it became, a few years after, maybe 1 year, technology collaboration program from the IEA. So it's one of the technology collaboration program that is special, since there's the two tag names. I will briefly talk also about the mission innovation, and especially the green powered future mission, because I think it's something that is relevant also for the discussion today, and also to make sure that you see the link between the two. Just a map you can look after of the different countries involved in the ISGAN. So the International Smart Grid Action Network, and I'll try to use more ISGAN from now on. It's going to be quicker. I'll save probably a few minutes. Is the only government-to-government forum on smart grid. So there's different working group. It changed with time. I'll briefly talk about some of them today. Regarding mission innovation, one of the differences is more involvement of the private sector. There's different mission in there. The one that is not necessarily the most interesting, but the more applied to the discussion today, is the Green Powered Future Mission. The Green Powered Future Mission, which we refer to GPFM, has a goal to demonstrate by 2030 that power systems in different geographies can effectively manage and integrate up to 100% variable renewable energy, like wind and solar for sure. And also achieving that with cost-efficient, secure, and resilient systems. So at this point, you're probably wondering what's the difference between this MI and ISGAN. Mission innovation is a bit more in research and development, looking at innovation to modernize the power system. And if we want to talk about ISGAN, it's more on deployment side. So looking at some standard, policy, best practice, capacity building, price, and recognition also. So all that is done with a network of experts from the various countries. If we want to talk about more technical aspect, I'll give some example of Working Group 5, Market and Regulation, Working Group 6 and Working Group 9, and some policy aspect in Working Group 6 and 7. And all that for sure is leveraged with the Communication Working Group to make sure it's disseminated and so the Communication Working Group is working a bit with everyone. So what about the different working groups? So first, the Working Group 5, which is the most technical, is called the Smart Grid International Research Facility Network, commonly referred as SURFN. It's really a network of smart grid researchers that generally have testing facilities. So a lot of national labs from the participating country are working in that. I won't go into detail of everything for each of the working group, but just to mention that the test protocol for distributed energy functions We're part of that. We was led from Canada, and now moving to a new model that will be joint research activity and knowledge sharing. So basically, a country can propose a new activity, they're the leader, and if we have enough supporting members from the 26 countries that are interested, we're moving with that topic. So an example of what is done in this group, inverter lab testing. So there's a lot of discussion about the very important role of power electronics and inverters in the future. Many countries came together and looked at testing facility. Part of the thing that was done is harmonize the way they're tested, looking at standard, the grid interconnection and grid codes in the various countries, and also improving accuracy and repeatability of the result by making sure that each country were achieving similar result, and also to look at the difference in the grid code in every country. All that with a lot of sharing and open source code, test protocols. So it's really a pretty interesting collaboration. If we look at what's the link with the modeler community, if you want to talk about inverters, you have to start at the bottom of this pyramid with the resource and devices. So you develop grid following, grid forming inverter models, the device themselves, and you include that in grid simulation. Then you look at the second layer, which is implementation and operability. You do lab testing of inverter, test protocol, interconnection. That was done by the various labs. And then you look at how these advanced inverter function, will be developed and used, and how they will change the operation strategy in the distribution power system with high penetration of inverter-based resources. And finally, you have to look at grid studies on the bulk system. What would be the change if we have a lot of inverter-based resources, and how that can be embedded into the planning studies that many of you are doing. So moving to working group 6. My French, I cannot hide my French. So working group 6. Power and transmission and distribution. This one focused more on system-related challenge. 4 working group. Again, I won't go into detail. A lot of material. I think we had over 100 slides before cutting down for this presentation. Example of working group 6 activities, network planning and decision making under uncertainty. Some work was done with also policy guidance document that are pretty high level, for sure peer-to-peer learning, some webinar. Flexibility and storage as an alternative to building new grid infrastructure. I was talking about multiplying by 2 or 3. That's an example. It was something that was done with Horizon 2020 in Europe. Also, some guidelines for regulator. Generally, there's always an intent to try to bring that to a pretty high level for policy people. Defining the aggregator roles in digitalized energy systems, and also all the TSO and DSO interaction. A lot of discussion about that, how their different role, how it's going to evolve. One of the projects that was shared to me to present is also the Flex Plan project to introduce new storage and flexibility resources and grid planning methodology. A lot of aspect was looked in this project. I'm seeing time going down, so I'll go fast. New planning methodology, new tools for optimizing T&D grid planning, also where this flexibility should be placed. All the alternatives to traditional grid planning, including storage, electric vehicle, demand response. This was done also in some scenario around Europe to apply the tools, and for sure some regulatory guideline for the regulator to see all this. If we want to move to working group 7, it's one of the working group that is less technical and looking more at the institutional and social change. It's not the one that I know the most, but just to say that it's a pretty important component also on the behavior and all this. So a lot of work toward, again, transition process and pathways, future model for, and what they call translation function. So how this will apply in the in the social change, structural institutional change. One thing that was done recently is the NISGAN glossary. For some, it may sound special to say a glossary, but things are evolving quite a lot. So Working Group 7 started a new task to find new ways to improve the ability to communicate with all sectors. Moving to Working Group 9, flexibility markets. So for sure, we're talking a lot about the market design for power system flexibility. All that will be embedded in our future grid. It's something that must be done at different time scale, from long-term investment signal to even second-to-second balancing. So when we talk about flexibility, the time scale are quite different. It's also physics that goes from large centralized generation to equipment that could be behind the meter. So again, there's a lot of very different equipment toward that flexibility. And a lot of also debate on the best practice in the market design. So these three focus areas, the first one in end-use flexibility characterization and grid utilization, that one is led by Canada and people in our team. So there's one on interoperability. All that will happen. All things will talk together from transmission to the behind-the-meter equipment, and also operational and long-term planning. So some progress and outcome that are quite recent in this case. Fact sheet on the indicator of a flexibility potential. The idea is to have a taxonomy and to capture the real feasible flexibility potential, because it's not the theoretical one. The different actions that are needed for the stakeholders to have some real local flexibility market. The key parameter also to identify the flexibility potential. And also what kind of services this flexibility could offer. In the interoperability, they're looking more at market coordination and standardization, and also energy data and digitalization. A lot of data will come with that. And the operational and long-term planning, with summary of, recently they did some interview of many stakeholders in all the, but not all, but in many of the participating countries, analysis on that, and how the flexibility will be embedded in the long-term distribution network planning. Also the work on the different tariff options that are needed to enable that consumer flexibility. So a lot of work, a lot of interesting material. It's hard to give a summary of all over 14 years, 13 to 14 years of work from ISGAN with 26 countries, with participating members from and experts from all these countries. There's an official YouTube channel. You can find a webinar, some example there that may be relevant or not to your work. A lot of publication, generally joint publication with always a lot of participation. So to conclude, yes, we need electrification, we need grid expansion. They are essential for the carbon neutral energy framework. We need smart grid, I think, to achieve that also. ISGAN provide expertise to help to shape the grid of the future through government forum. I'd like to add also that it's much more than just government. If anything sounds interesting to some of you, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm part of the executive committee representing Canada in this task. There's academia people, there could be utility industry. What we need is experts that are interested to share, to work, to make things going faster. So new collaboration from Canadians are always welcome. And it's something that is evolving with time and changing. So even if nothing resonates to you now and you have an interesting thing about smart grid, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm part of the people that believe that the amplitude of the grid expansion will depend on how we plan and capture the full potential of the system, and it includes regulatory, market, technical, and policy aspects. These working groups are working clearly on that. So that's it. I'll take an extra, I have another minute So just to mention that in the mission innovation, Green Powered Future mission, there's an intent to do some flagship project. And probably that some of you are aware that right now there's a smart grid call for smart grid program to support some demonstration project in Canada. One of these projects will have an opportunity to raise their profile internationally at the Mission Innovation and collaborate with Mission Innovation for networking and knowledge exchange, and also to share tools and work. So just to mention that if you are looking at the Smart Grid program, which has the open call right now, keep in mind that if your project is looking at high penetration of variable renewable energy, there's an opportunity also to be involved in the mission innovation and have your project as a flagship project. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Alex, thank you for setting the smart grid stage. And now we'll go to Conrad Fox, who is going to talk about planning with changing technology.
I'll wait a second for my slides to show up. Well, I guess as I'm waiting, I might as well introduce who I am. Conrad Fox. I'm at the IESO. We're the Independent Electricity System Operator in Ontario. So we run the real-time markets, do real-time operations, and also long-term planning of the power system in Ontario. And that's, there we go. Oh, perfect. And that's where I come in. I'm been working in the long-term planning department for about a decade now. And it's been quite interesting. And I feel like it's very apropos to some of the recent insights we've been dealing with. So excited to get into it. So it's going to be less about IESO. It's more just about kind of details on modeling in itself. So it might be, I'm trying to keep it high enough level that it should be interesting, and also low enough level that it's interesting to really modeling people. So maybe I hit the mark, maybe I didn't. We'll see what happens. So resource planning models. Well, I'll do a really quick overview of some of the models that we're working on that help us see the future. As the name of this is choosing our future, we need to see what that future is to be able to choose it. We'll see where we are today, where we want to be tomorrow, some of the challenges with getting us there, and then I'll propose a few new ideas that we're kicking around internally to try and get us there. So from a really high level, there's sort of three big planning models that we work with. There's capacity expansion models, which is what I will be discussing in detail later, so I'll get into that in more detail in a second. But an important takeaway here is it's a deterministic model, and it is typically at an annual time scale. Again, all of this will become a bit more fleshed out in a second. Resource adequacy models are probabilistic and at an hourly time scale. So probabilistic meaning there's not a single deterministic run. The outcome is a distribution of potential outcomes. And then there's production cost modeling, which is a deterministic model where you do a single view of the future. You see what your schedule looks like, and you're trying to come up with things at an hourly or sub-hourly level, things like which units are you turning on, how much does it cost, all that sort of stuff. So key concept takeaways here are just probabilistic versus deterministic, and then different timescales of these different models, hourly, sub-hourly, annually. Okay, so what is a capacity expansion model? Well, this model has actually, interestingly, become a much more common tool than it has in the recent past, and that is because this is very much a centralized planning concept. You're figuring out things like you take in your demand projections, your policies, your technological costs, and future performance advancements, all that sort of stuff, fuel prices. You slam it all together, and it's more of an investment model. It's giving you a trajectory of where you want to go. So in this really simplified graph here, you can see there's some sort of like planned stuff that's coming in this future here, and then there's modeled stuff. So this is just a model outcome, a potential pathway that one could go. And as I said, it's becoming a very common tool. We're using it a lot more frequently now as the way to chart a path forward does require this sort of centralized planning outlook a little bit more these days. Even places like Texas, which are the most, I'd say, ideologically energy-only marketplace I've ever seen, they're starting to use these types of models. They're doing centralized procurements. That I don't know if you saw that they're doing that recently, which I thought was quite interesting. They've been very much open markets this whole way until now. There we go. Okay, so where are we today? I'm trying to breeze through this really quickly, but this is really old school power system planning from like the 40s, 50s kind of thing. Just to bring this up so that I can sort of show we're not really that much further along, to be honest. So like what this graph is showing us here on the top graph here on the y-axis, it's basically your capital cost for all these individual types of resources: nuclear, coal, natural gas. Again, it's the old school way. So these were the resources. The idea is that then all the way at the right, the 8760, that would be the cost of running this thing, the all-in cost of running it 100% throughout the year. So the way that you go across this thing is you see, okay, well, where natural gas is the cheapest is, at a low capacity factor here, and then where nuclear is the cheapest is at a really high capacity factor, and then the stuff in the middle gets done by coal. This is literally how power system planning had been done back in the day. Okay, so how do you extend this to include new resources? Well, say there's wind or solar. Well, this x-axis is essentially a capacity factor. So you can get a capacity factor for your wind. You assume, you just guess, or you take you analyze how much wind you expect there to be in a year, and you can turn that into an energy number. And so you can put a dot here on this plot, and that dot would represent what that value of wind is, or that value of solar, for example. So you can still kind of put that into the picture, but now what happens when you add storage into this? Storage's capacity factor is 100% dependent on when you need it to charge and when you need it to discharge. And so it's actually completely impossible to put on this graph. I've thought about it, there's really no way I can figure out how you put that on this graph. So, continuing on where we are today, this is really simplified graphic where coordinator in the middle here is not just like a system operator, this is also participants in a market. They're receiving information and forecasts, making their decisions, coordinating, and then schedules get sent out. And the idea is, yep, you got your regional demand on the right here. You've got your coordinators in the middle, moving your generation fleet so that they both match together. Great. That's the sort of simple overview of how things have worked so far. Okay, where do we need to be tomorrow? Well, it gets a little bit more complicated. In fact, I think I missed a few arrows here, but the coordinator is now receiving information from both the regional demand, the generation fleet, and the storage fleet to understand, okay, well, what is available and what do I need to be able to do in the near future? And realistically, there should be a double arrow to regional demand. This gets into that smart grid flexibility concept where we also need to start coordinating better with the demand side to really make all of this fit together. The whole point here is that the coordination is vastly more complicated. There's a lot more parts. It's not just you're moving your supply fleet to meet your demand. It's you're moving your supply, you're anticipating what your supply is going to do, you're moving your storage, you're anticipating what demand is going to do. It's a lot more complicated. Okay, so where do we need to be tomorrow? We need to be able to model systems with significantly fewer dispatchable resources. That's, I think we're all on board with that. We understand why. We need to become experts in modeling systems with a lot of these variable generation, a lot of storage, and innovative demand response techniques. These are critical to our future. And a lot of these off-the-shelf models don't necessarily get there, and I'll show you why in a second here. We need to embrace this uncertainty. And what I mean by that is a robust technique for understanding/planning for the impact of possible future weather scenarios. This is getting at that probabilistic versus deterministic concept, where a deterministic model would take like a single weather view, a single cost view, and then just say, okay, great, that's what I need to do going forward. We all know that as you add more variable resources, the impact of that variability is critical. So we absolutely need to understand what that's going to do to our system. Okay, so the current CEMs, or capacity expansion models, which are sort of these longer-term resource investment models, how do they actually do it? Well, it's typically a cost minimization type model where you're minimizing the cost of buying new stuff and then serving your load. Those are the general sort of costs that are in these models. And then there's two sort of general important constraints: annual peak capacity balance and your annual energy balance. You want to buy enough capacity to meet your needs. You want to buy enough energy to meet your needs. And there's some smaller bits here, but I don't think I have time to get into that. Okay, so what does it mean by an annual peak capacity balance? Well, this is sort of a look at Ontario's load, just a general load curve. And you can see, boom, where that red circle is, that was the peak for the year. So we want to be able to build enough stuff to meet that peak. That's the largest requirement that we're expecting in that year. And of course, there's some capacity, some reserve margin as well that you put in there. Okay, CEMs can handle that. That's relatively good. The current ones are good at that. Now it's the annual energy balance. So this is relatively simple to understand as well, where you're just forcing the model to buy enough stuff to meet your expected energy need. But this is where the problems start. So think about this. If you have an annual energy balance at a single number, you're compressing all of the year's energy requirements to a single number. There are some issues, and I'll explain why in a second. So if you're looking at the dispatchable resources, similar to those curves I was showing earlier, it's actually probably not too bad to assume an annual energy balance. You can have that inherent assumption that I can move this resource around when I need to move it around, which is, you're going to see, quite a luxury once you get into the more detailed of the other ones. So a dispatchable resource works pretty well with this annual energy constraint. A baseload resource, okay, it works kind of okay. The methodology's all right if you assume it's a flat output. There might be some seasonal impacts that you're missing, but baseload's all right. Variable generation, it becomes a lot more difficult at an annual timescale. You can figure out how much energy your wind farm is going to produce and see how much energy you need in a year, and if those numbers match, you still might be in trouble, right? Because the wind might be blowing all in the winter, and you need it all in the summer. You have no concept of when it's happening with this type of model. And then furthermore, so you see that issue, and you think, okay, great, storage will solve that, right? That's what storage is for. Now you put that into the mix, and at the annual timescale, genuinely, I have no idea what a lot of these models are assuming. Like how do you understand the role of storage is to move the variable generation to when it's needed, from when it isn't needed to when it's needed. At a single annual timescale, I don't understand how it makes that call. So challenges with the current capacity models is this temporal granularity concept. That's when does the wind blow and when do I need my energy? That is the critical question to answer. And there's another potential issue, which is these deterministic optimizations. We need to consider these uncertainties. Weather's always changing. Future costs and performances might be changing. We need to make sure we understand what that's going to do to our system. So, why is this even a problem? For system planners like myself, it's mostly just it's really time consuming and you don't know if you have the optimal solution. So I'll give you an example. You run a capacity expansion model, it gives you a supply mix. Now what we're going to do is we're going to put it through our resource adequacy model, which is that probabilistic model. And since we started with a deterministic one, we put it through that model, it fails. It doesn't actually meet the mark. So we have to use some modeler's discretion to figure out what else we need to add. Rerun it, keep going, iterating back and forth, and you can see where the issues might arise, because I'm using a lot of discretion here. And that's just for the resource adequacy model. You then have to do the exact same thing with a production cost model. So there's an insane amount of back and forth iterations, and at the end of the day, since it's not necessarily all the trade-offs aren't being contained within that one model, I'm not entirely sure if it's optimal, or if it's considered all the trade-offs. And then I'm calling this non-expert studies. That's, I should say, less like system engineering studies, more of like the larger scale, like economy-wide type studies. No doubt they probably just generate dubious results coming out of these CEMs. I mean, I don't want to say dubious, but less, what's the word I'm looking for? Less validated. Like they obviously, it's not their role to go through and do this incredible amount of iteration to get a system which actually looks like it solves. So what are some answers? So some new approaches that we're looking at. This is relatively straightforward, a Monte Carlo analysis. Basically, I like this, it's a bit of a brute force and ignorance method. What you do is you just blast your model 1,000 times with 1,000 different weather scenarios and 1,000 different scenarios of whatever you want to, whatever uncertainty you want to model. So it's relatively straightforward, but the issue of why it hasn't happened yet in a significant way in most places is you need to be able to run a large number of scenarios. I've said the word 1,000, and some of these models, like off-the-shelf capacity expansion models that I'm working with, take about 20 minutes to an hour. It's infeasible, realistically, to do 1,000 runs at an hour. I mean, it's possible, but yeah, not that easy. So, new concept is to try and Monte Carlo this to understand the uncertainty. You need to be able to reduce the size of the problem to make it eligible to be able to be run 1,000 times relatively quickly. And then the next thing under investigation is explicitly model this relationship between supply, demand, and energy. Now, this is where I'm going to go off a little bit into the deep end, so feel free to save your questions till the end, but I'm happy to answer all of them. Okay, so for this part, when you're modeling, as we've sort of established, that relationship between when the wind blows and when it's needed is absolutely critical. And energy storage is in the middle there to help us, but as well as other dispatchable resources can also be in the middle there to help us. So we were working on these new concepts where in the actual formulation of the capacity expansion model, the energy that is used to charge is a decision variable. So like each hour, there's an amount of energy to charge your storage. And I'll get into this more in a second. And then the actual energy used, like the amount of energy you need to deliver from your dispatchable fleet plus your storage is also a decision variable. So the model is actually deciding what these curves look like that they're serving, because that is of critical importance in this new world. So this is sort of a, well, I guess it was red, but now it's kind of orange. But so in this red area here, or let me back up. The blue line is what we're looking at as a base load, and the yellow line is demand. So demand is, people consuming, and there's, that nice daily pattern. This base load here, I'm making it a combination of your nuclear, your run-of-river hydro, wind, and solar. So that's why it's kind of all over the place, because you've got your wind, your solar, and all that other stuff in there. So the concept that we're working with, which is providing some pretty good results so far, is you define anything that is where this sort of the green area is as you're available for charging. So if you have a more base load than what your current load is, there's a bucket of energy there. I'm saying that is available for charging. The red spot here, or orange spot, is basically saying we need extra energy, right? My base load is not covering enough to fill my demand, so we need to either have it from our storage fleet or from our dispatchables fleet. With this relatively simple concept, you now have the capacity expansion model now understands that as you add solar and wind, you're moving that base load profile up, which immediately impacts what you can charge and immediately impacts what you need to serve later. So all of these trade-offs between your base load and storage and dispatchables is endogenously determined right inside the model. So we're seeing some interesting results with this so far. So I'll sort of recap here. The capacity expansion models are really the primary tool used today to analyze a cost-optimal electricity infrastructure build-out under various different future projections and conditions. The current CEMs are, I would say, a bit inadequate if you're using them just on their own, especially if you're looking at deep decarbonization scenarios, which is what I'm assuming we're all looking at. It requires, in my view, too much discretion from me. I would rather the model have all the information and it crunches the numbers for me. And then there's, I think, two relatively simple, well, simple to say but hard to do concepts to try and improve this. So to capture the uncertainties, reduce the complexity of the capacity expansion model so that you can have it solved relatively quickly, and then give it a whole ton of different weather scenarios. And then the next thing you could do is model things at the hourly timescale to maintain that supply-demand storage relationship so that you can really understand what you need in terms of the variable resources and storage to meet that changing system need. And I think that's all I had to do. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Conrad, for setting the table for Darren, who is now going to walk us through New Brunswick Power's experience of integrated planning. I think we need Darren's slides.
Yeah, I guess while we wait for that to come up, it's an interesting problem. We actually recently, I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but we recently changed our capacity energy modeling tool that will allow us to do hourly dispatch and things like that. So we can consider the issues of the variable renewables as well as storage. Like that was one big change that we made between our 2020 IRP and our 2023 IRP. And to deal with this problem of net zero, I think that's absolutely critical. There's still some work we need to do on addressing uncertainty. We're still, not hitting all the points that Conrad identified, but definitely we've made a lot of strides in the last few years in modernizing our tools. But that's not what I'm here to talk about exactly, so happy to field questions on that when we get to the Q&A session. But I want to talk to you guys about MB Power's 2023 Integrated Resource Plan. And I think we need to spend a little bit of time kind of understanding what MB Power's specific situation is, as well as what the problem is that's coming at us, in order to kind of see where we're identifying the issues of net zero. And it's a little, it's different than I think the way that a lot of other people or modelers are seeing the issue. And so I want to kind of get into our experience and what we've seen. So just a little bit about MB Power. We're not that big, I guess, is one of the main things I want to say here. 3,800 megawatts of generating capacity, about 13 terawatt hours of total energy sales. That's, a tenth of Quebec, for example, roughly. But we're still, a relatively robust system with about 3,400 megawatts of peak demand, almost 400,000 customers. So we're not too small, but we're relatively small, and that does help, I think, give us some advantages in our solving our models and addressing these issues of problem size. So the starting point for us from an overall greenhouse gas management perspective, all of our targets are set based on the 2005 levels. So we want to see the province's goal, I think, was a 30% reduction from that 2005 level. They've since increased that to 40%, I think, now from 2005 levels. But we're basically we're almost there. We're really close. So MB Power's had significant reductions since 2005, down about 70% from those levels. And so what we're trying to do now is squeeze the last little bit of carbon out of our system. So we've taken great strides to reduce the operation of a number of our what used to be base-loaded thermal plants that are now running more seasonally, shutting down a coal plant and an oil plant. We still have one coal plant, one major oil-fired plant, and one natural gas plant that are making up our emissions today. But the problem of net zero for us is about, how do we limit those resources? How do we replace those with new non-emitting technologies? So what is net zero? I'm not the expert in this, but what we've kind of taken as the definition is we want to hit about a 95% reduction from that 2005 level. To us, I think that meets all the objectives that we've laid out internally as achieving net zero. So it's not going to completely zero carbon, but something that's very, very low. And so one of the key things for us is we don't really have an option for carbon capture storage, but we do have this provision for small capacity factors for those emitting generating stations. So that's currently in the draft clean energy regulation, 450 hours per year, which is about 5% of the time. And that's needed for when the wind isn't there, peak is extremely high. We have a lot of import-export markets that we regularly exchange with. So if those get curtailed or there's issues in transmission, that's when those emitting generators would help fill in the gap. The 2023 IRP, which is on our website now, we propose, I think there's 16 different scenarios in there, all of which achieve net zero. And the real final point, I guess, for net zero for us is people asking, well, do you need nuclear? Do you need wind? Do you need solar? Do you need storage? Yes, 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 and yes. You need just about everything in order to make it work. So you need a little bit of everything. And there's no one technology that's going to save us, no one thing that's going to help us achieve net zero, but a nice diverse mix of those resources is really where we see the strengths. So I think this is where New Brunswick is maybe in a different place than a lot of other areas. We talk about electrification. I think that boils down to 4 key buckets here. So home heating is a big one. New Brunswick currently is about 75% electric heat. So we've basically decarbonized, or not decarbonized, electrified our space heating sector. The next biggest use for heating, home heating next biggest fuel for home heating in New Brunswick is wood. So that, some people have perspectives on that, but that's relatively renewable. It's coming from trees. So oil would be third and natural gas would be fourth. So we have relatively low emissions when it comes to the home heating sector. And because of that, we have, a 75% electric heat. About half of that is heat pumps, and about half of that is still primarily baseboard heating. So when you think about the transition that we've seen in the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of people moving from electric baseboard to heat pumps. We've seen people moving from oil to heat pumps. Seen people supplementing their wood systems with heat pumps as well. And so there's a reduction you get in your overall energy needs when you move from electric baseboard to a heat pump, but there's an increase if you move from a non-electric fuel to a heat pump. And those things have largely canceled out for us. There hasn't been that much growth in that space, but the way I view it, I guess, is that there's enough electric energy in New Brunswick now to heat every single home. We just got to do a better job of spreading it out, do more energy efficiency, get heat pumps into those last few that have the emitting generation or emitting home heating systems, and then also put some heat pumps into those places that still have baseboard. But there's enough electricity there to kind of go around. So home heating, we're basically there. When we look at our load shape, I would consider it mature from an overall electrification of home heating perspective. And when we get to our load shape, it's very different than the one that Conrad showed. EVs is another thing that is coming, but it's maybe not as big of an issue as people often think of. I don't think it is. EV is roughly the same size as an electric water heater when it comes to load. Right now, we have 90-something% of our electric water heating fleet, our water heating fleet electrified in New Brunswick. And so we're like, okay, well, that's just doubling of that load. It shouldn't be that big of a deal. So as we ramp up EVs and get to commercial vehicles electrifying, it starts to change things a little bit. But between now and 2035, the EVs will make a small impact, but not a major impact. Existing industrial is another one where we have a heavy pulp and paper sector in New Brunswick, and that is largely electrified. They have a small amount of natural gas or oil-fired support there, but the vast majority of their load and processes now are electrified. And so we see in existing industrial something that, we think it's going to grow probably about 1% per year, but it's, again, a manageable transition, not a big, stark difference. New industry is really where we see disruption. This is the one that keeps me up at night, is some scenarios we talk about. We talk to developers sometimes, talking, we want to bring 3,000 megawatts of electrolysis load to New Brunswick. It's like, okay, well, that's a big difference for us. It's a lot of load. That would double our load, or more than double our total energy, double our peak. So things like that could be very, very disruptive. So that's where we see a lot of the uncertainty is on that. What happens with new industry? What new direction do we go in order to electrify the rest of the economy? How much load does that mean for New Brunswick? So that's the one that I think we really see when we look at our scenarios in our integrated resource plan. That's the big one. That's the big delta that drives our higher load scenarios. So our load shape, as promised, this is what ours looks like. So this is a fiscal year, so it can be jarring, but you start in April and in March. But we see the summer period is a relatively flat and even load with not a whole lot of variability. And then you get to the winter and it's like completely different. There's a lot of variability in the winter. Temperature drives a major difference for us in our load. And I think as other areas start to electrify their heating systems, that they're going to end up in the same situation. Right now, the AC industry is almost purely electric. So we've already electrified that load. But as we electrify those heating systems in buildings and in homes, we're going to see growth in those winter months. And when you think about AC load, you're talking about the room temperature was 21 or 22. Outdoor temperature is often 30, 35, 40 at the worst. But we're talking a 15-degree difference there. When it's cold out, it's minus 20, minus 30 sometimes. That's a 50-degree difference. So the magnitude of the electricity you need to close that gap between the ambient outdoor temperature and what you want for your comfort in your home is very different in the winter. And the efficiency of a heat pump is also vastly reduced when you get to those minus 20, minus 30. And we see a lot of noise kind of and sensitivity to that overall winter temperature. We've had our coldest day of the year last year was minus 28, I think, minus 29. We've had years where that's been minus 12. We've had years where that's been minus 35. But there's a big gap in what that number can be and a lot of uncertainty. So what this really means for us is that we have, I get some points on here, but summer average load about 1350. The winter average is 1,000 megawatts higher than that. And then the peak demand in the winter is 1,000 megawatts higher than that again. And so what do you use to kind of solve these kind of three levels of load? And so I kind of look at this as there's two challenges to net zero. It's meeting that peak, that winter day, the coldest day of the year. That's where a lot of that uncertainty comes in and things like that. But for that, there's good tools for that. There's batteries can help you do that. The flexibility we have in our limited hydro system can help us do that. The peaker provision within the clean electricity regulation can help you do that. Manage that peak demand, that coldest day of the year, that coldest time. That's not that difficult. The real challenge is this one, the seasonal energy volume challenge. That 1,000 megawatts that you only need in January, February, a few weeks in March and December, that you don't need the rest of the year, where does that come from? And you can't get that by running a thermal plant for 5% of the hours in a year. You need it for 10 weeks. So how do you address that? And so we have a few strategies within our IRP, but it's largely an overbuild. So you're overbuilding wind, you're overbuilding solar, you're overbuilding baseload nuclear, you're overbuilding like battery storage, things like that to help respond to this challenge of the seasonal energy volume. And the stark difference between the summer and the winter. We also have in our plan a conversion of our coal plant to biomass and then limiting the operation of that to the winter period, which also helps us address a big chunk of that. So our overall generation mix changes. We see traditional thermal is where we have retirements. We don't really have retirements otherwise, and then some new builds. So we see fast start peakers being built in the future. That's largely you just need to change the dynamics of what you have for your thermal fleet. You got to get away from boilers and things like that in these slower units that need 3 days to start to something that you can turn on in 10 minutes. So that's where we see retirement of our oil-fired plant, retirement of our coal-fired plant eventually, and we see new builds with combustion turbines, fast start peakers, things like that. We see new nuclear to help fill in the base load gaps. We see a lot more new variable renewables, predominantly for New Brunswick that would be mostly wind. It is kind of the dominant, be 80 to 90% of that bar. And wind is helpful for us because our solar regime isn't that great, but wind, it's actually windier, or you get more wind production generally in the winter than you do in the summer, so it helps from that seasonal aspect a little bit. And then battery storage, we see some of that. But battery storage is largely limited to balancing day-to-day fluctuations, and it doesn't really help with the real challenge of that seasonal fluctuation. And then I think the other in here is that biomass conversion that I spoke to. So what does this do to our overall emissions? When we close down all of our base-loaded thermal plants and switch to these fast start peakers that only turn on a few times a year, we see massive reductions in our overall emissions. So after we hit 2035 and the CER would take hold, we see reductions down to, I think it's about 0.2 or 0.3 megatons per year, something like that. But it's a 98% reduction from what we had in 2005. So a very, very different emission profile. We've already squeezed out as much as we could from the orange, and now we're kind of like going at it even harder. It's basically dry at that point. And that last little tiny bit is important. And I got a slide to kind of demonstrate where that last little bit of emissions goes and the role that it plays. So This is an hourly chart of just a specific week that we pulled out of our model that shows some of the overbuild issues. So this is looking, down the line quite a ways, but I think this is a 2043, one of our higher load scenarios. But the green in this, the dark green is all of our wind and solar. You see a lot of variability there, including the light green on the top is also the wind and solar. And then the top of the dark green, though, is our load. So anything above that is something that we don't necessarily need or we would need to curtail. And then the blue is kind of responding to all that. So when you see the drops in the blue, that's us probably, reducing imports, exporting, things like that, to try to integrate that wind, but we still can't quite make it. So there's a bit of an overbuild challenge here, and we would need to curtail some of that energy. And then the last slide I have here, I guess, is just this high load, low renewable challenge. And this is a very low wind, very calm week in the winter. So what we see for like a weather pattern would be a high pressure system in the winter, drives extremely low temperatures, and also comes with a very dead air. There's no wind at all quite often. And we have a relatively small geographic area for our province. And so what we see is the wind and solar goes almost to zero for 4 days. And what do you do to meet that? Okay, I got my nuclear in my base. I've got my hydro system, imports, batteries, doing everything they can. Most of that is actually imports, so you're importing as much as you possibly can. And then in addition to that, you still need something. So what do? This is why you have those peakers to turn on for this little bit of a period when you need that support. So the emitting generation that was so small you could barely see it on the last chart. It's a very small part of the annual mix. It's a very big part of this particular week, and without it, we would have had, or we would project rolling blackouts for 30% of the province for 4 days, and that's not where you want to be. That's not going to pass the reliability test that we would perform. So the emitting generation just has a very specific role in this case. And I think getting to this point where we've got to 98% reduction in those emissions, this is kind of the goal of this IRP. I don't think we see that as the end state where this is where we're going to be forever. But we kind of envision if you only need that much fuel, maybe we can make that into some sort of renewable fuel in the future. But one thing at a time. We went from 70%, where we had a 70% reduction in emissions. We went from 9 megatons down to 3. Now we're going to go from 3 down to 0.3, and then the next step will take us, hopefully, from that 0.3 down to 0. But, I'm not sure when we'll be crossing that bridge. But, this is the real rub with the net zero challenge. I want people to think about that from their own, whatever area they're looking at. What happens when I electrify all the heating load? What does that do to my load shape? And it introduces a lot of issues with the seasonal energy problem that I think is currently not being fully formed in some studies. So thank you very much for the time. Happy to take some questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Darren. We now have about 16 minutes for questions. Eduardo, I want to land us on time. So there are mics if you have questions. There may be a Mentimeter approach, but Eduardo, I don't see a Mentimeter. Any questions for the mics? All right. And just a reminder, please introduce yourself before you ask your question.
Yes. So if this is working. Hi, my name is Joanne Whitmore. I'm a senior researcher at the Chair of Energy Sector at HEC Montréal. I was very happy for the last slide of the planning for integrated resources. We're hoping in Quebec we can do that. If you have a problem in New Brunswick, we have a big problem in Quebec. As you know, we had 23,000 megawatts of demand for new capacity for big projects for batteries and increasingly for hydrogen. And so my question is, actually, in what you were showing, did was it including these new industries? Because in Quebec, it's major. Like, I mean, the amount of hydrogen that wants to be produced, because we're all focused on electricity, but for me, hydrogen produced from renewables is basically kind of resold electricity in another format. And we're not like really considering how much this is, given that hydrogen today is actually a climate problem because we're producing fertilizer, we're producing all kinds of chemical refineries, and it's actually emitting 2% of global emissions, but we're all focused on making this new energy. So I'm wondering how this reality, and in Canada there's also an obsession with the hype of hydrogen, how is it going to be really integrated into the model, because it's pretty big. And the second point is how do you calculate renunciation costs? I think in English you call it opportunity costs for doing that instead of other things we could do to manage that peak or to reduce our energy demand instead of focusing on these important, like hydrogen's important, but it's going to be a very niche, no regret sectors, I think, from what most of the modeling is showing. So how do you capture these?
Sure. So in our 2023 Integrated Resource Plan, we looked at a scenario that contemplated 1,000 megawatts of additional load that was kind of unassigned, but you know, in my brain, I kind of picture that as materializing as like a hydrogen load. And so like it's really hard to say like how that industry is going to evolve over time, but we see a real immediate need right now. The refinery in New Brunswick actually produces hydrogen for their process using methane reformation, and it's a high emission process, and they're looking at how can they move to electrolysis. So they've already started going down that path. They have a small electrolysis system that they're going to be installing in a couple of years. But there's about 250 megawatts of load there just on their hydrogen production side. And so that to me is very real. You don't need this whole hydrogen economy to emerge for that to materialize. So I think that one, I wrap my head around. But the uncertainty on the other question, like where does this go? Like honestly, like you seem like you've been in some of these meetings where they're pitching these crazy projects. I've been in those too. And it's really hard to kind of, you know, put a likelihood to any of those things. So, you know, in the absence of knowing what's coming, we said, well, let's see if it were 1,000 megawatts higher, what would we do? If it was 1,000 megawatts higher than that again, you know, we haven't looked at that in as much detail, but you know, if the first 1,000 comes, then we'll take that next step. But I think for us, it's more of a one piece at a time approach. We don't have quite as low rates as Hydro-Quebec does, so I think they're maybe going there first. So we'll see how that shakes out. But I know we all went through this again with the crypto mining sector a few years ago. So I anticipate it being much the same. To your second point on how do you consider the policy and things like that, like I think that's a bigger discussion than the energy modelers. That's usually like driven by government and, you know, the economic opportunity associations, things like that, that are really driving these new people and trying to sell New Brunswick as a location to them. So I don't really have a good answer for you on that one either, unfortunately.
All right. Thanks, Darren. We're going to go over to this mic. What I will say, we're getting great comments on the Mentimeter, but as you can all see, they're scrolling away. So I would recommend, we'll get to some if we have time, but I would recommend that you approach these three with your comments during the networking session. So over here.
Asha Poplowski, I'm from Department of Natural Canada. I just interested in New Brunswick. You didn't mention anything about the natural gas plants, and are there any business cases for LNG facilities to be invested in? There was talk about how there was some opportunities to transform some previous existing plants, and for export to Germany and Europe in order to take advantage of the LNG that's available in New Brunswick?
So there is an LNG facility in New Brunswick, but it's focused on bringing gas into New Brunswick today. So to turn all that equipment around and go the other way is something that people have definitely looked at. But there's an issue that the kind of the way the natural gas system developed in the Maritimes was around, is anchored by like Sable Island gas and a source of gas locally, and that currently doesn't really exist. So we're importing the vast majority of our gas today from the United States or from the LNG facility. And so to kind of turn that around without a domestic supply, I don't think we see that as highly likely. I think that there's certain political players in New Brunswick who would like to see natural gas be developed as an industry in New Brunswick, because we do have shale gas deposits and things like that. And if that were to go ahead, then I would see LNG maybe becoming a viable solution and us exporting it. But in the absence of that, which I think there's a lot of political hurdles there, I don't really see that as a viable project.
Great. And then we're going to come over on this side.
Hi, Stefan Schott from Carleton University Sustainable Energy and Energy Engineering. I have a question also for Darren to deal with your winter peak emissions there. I wonder to what extent are you, like Quebec, as you know, has dynamic pricing for those 100 hours of super peak. So to what extent are you considering dynamic pricing where the rate goes up 10 times in those times, especially because I guess most New Brunswickers can go to wood in those times, and thermal load will probably be the biggest problem. And to what extent are you also thinking of bidirectional charging from all these electric vehicles?
Yeah, I guess I'll answer your first question first. We haven't fully deployed our advanced metering infrastructure today, so we don't have good visibility on an hourly resolution for the vast majority of our customers. For the largest customers, we do. And so right now, our efforts are on those customers. And so rather than have a critical peak price for those top 100 hours, we've developed more of a critical peak rebate program where we would incent those customers to reduce their load during those times. So that's the direction we've gone today. I'm not saying that we're closing the door on those other things, but we kind of need AMI first before we would get to something like that. So, you know, we'll see how things evolve, but we would need that foundational infrastructure first before we would offer a program like that to the masses. And I missed the
bidirectional charging from the EVs, since you have so many electric vehicles coming on load, like to using their load in those times.
Yeah, we haven't really, I don't know, that one to me seems difficult. There's a lot of barriers to overcome there, I think, just with vehicle manufacturers and things like that. So we're looking right now more at like, what are the more mature EV markets doing, looking into Europe and things like that, and seeing, you know, how are they handling it when they have, you know, most of their sales are EVs, where we feel like we have a little bit of time before we would need to get there. So not really doing a whole lot today. I know maybe you could talk to Mike Burke there. He's nodding at the table. He's the expert. Put your hand up, Mike.
Maybe I'll answer that too. Hello? Oh, it's working. I'll just take some of the heat off you there, Darren. In terms of bidirectional EV charging, I agree with you that one of the challenges, at least in my head, is what does the structure look like from the customer's point of view? Because, I mean, if I own a car, I don't want my asset getting degraded. And so all of the issues around all of that, I think, are complicated and outside of the engineering world. But if all of those got solved, I don't know if you've noticed, the theme today is basically we need dispatchable resources. There's not a lot of flexibility on our systems anymore. We're moving away from that. So anything that can add more flexibility is of extreme value. So if you can figure out a way to add elasticity to the demand curve, i.e. flexibility from rechargeable from EVs, it's going to be extremely valuable. So like I'm very open to it, of course.
I would say that first we need to start with smart charging. There's probably a lot to do before going with the bidirectional.
Okay, there's a question over here.
Hi, my name is Sophie Pellan from CanMed Energy. My question is to either Conrad or Darren. In your modeling, you mentioned that you take variable renewables like wind and solar, and you kind of model a net load, right? You kind of model them as non-dispatchable. But my understanding is that
if we want a lot of wind and solar, we're going to have to do a lot of curtailment. So I'm wondering how you handle modeling that curtailment dynamically if you're just subtracting something from the load.
Sure, I can go first. So I think at the granularity of a capacity expansion model, there isn't really any curtailment, if that makes, how do I say this? In that hourly model, if there is curtailment, I don't really see it. Where I see it is in production cost modeling, because that's really where you're getting into the details of like, okay, based on this weather scenario, this future outlook, what is every resource doing hourly? And that's where you get to the curtailment. And so usually in those production cost models, you're integrated in the entire Eastern Interconnect. So we see a lot of trade. So curtailment is the last thing, right? Like if there's opportunities to trade, opportunities to store it, anything will happen first. But there is curtailment that happens in the production cost model. That's really where we see it. So it's modeled as a must-take resource, if that makes sense, in our production cost model. Like as in it's very, very cheap. It's always going to run. And then to the extent that it absolutely has to, it will curtail it at the last second. But usually it tries to use it as much as we can.
Yeah, we have a slightly different approach to solving the same issue. When we do our capacity expansion modeling, it is at an hourly resolution. And so when we do that, we kind of two-step it. We do that part, and then we do our production cost modeling. But when we do that first step, we allow it to export that energy, but at no benefit. So it's a zero-cost export, zero revenue, which is mathematically just a curtailment. So we solve it through that. So we just let it export it, but don't allow it to reap any benefit from that. And then when we run our production cost modeling, then we would say, okay, now you could actually market that energy into the United States or to other areas, use it to support the export loads and things like that. So it's similar solve, but slightly different.
Great. We have 2 minutes and 52 seconds. So the last two questions need to be fast, as well as the answers. All right, over here, and then we'll end with Mark.
Yeah, Evan Pivnik with Clean Energy Canada. Conrad, I'm curious if you can expand at all on the work that ISO did with Dunsky on distributed resources. That seems to be the most, at least publicly available, the most like in-depth look at what we've had at the different resources, their ability to actually meet energy demand at different periods. And I'm just curious about any of the innovations you've seen, whether it's Vermont choosing non-wire alternatives in incorporating these types of resources, whether it's about trying to find ways to build the specific resources in, or to aggregate the services into either like a VPP model or something that lets us think about the service provision rather than the technology itself.
Those are tough questions. The Dunsky report, that's the DER Achievable Potential Study. Yeah, so that's looking at the achievable potential of different DERs across Ontario. So that study, it is worked into our, and I remember I have to go really fast, it's worked into our planning process from the DR side, if that makes sense. So like basically, in terms of available resources that we have to us, it has formed a subset of those. It has formed a subset of those in terms of mostly on the demand side, not in terms of the wind or like a rooftop solar or a battery. The way we model it and consider it is, and I'll go to the regional level in a second. This is from the high level, looking at the whole system. We cost everything at transmission connected level. So if you're solar at the transmission connected cost, is X dollars. If you have a behind the meter solution, which there's a bunch of other benefits that we don't look into, right? So if those benefits make it the same price or cheaper than the transmission cost, in my mind, like the system should be indifferent. So that's kind of how it's a bit of a sleight of hand, but that's essentially because we were already talking about the granularity issues of the time granularity. So now if you add locational granularity, the problem becomes extremely massive. So to add that in, we actually have a regional planning process as well, which is less. It's not from the whole provincial scale. It's usually a specific region. So a region we've been working on recently is York region, for example. There's a lot of growth there, and in Windsor, there's a lot of greenhouse growth there. So then that's through that process. That's where we look at non-wires alternatives really closely, and I've worked very closely on a lot of those. So happy to chat further about that afterwards.
Great. And Mark, last question to you.
That was part of my question about DERs and the question of peaks, but It strikes me, a couple of things strike me. One is if we're talking about these winter peaks and we're talking about things that are only going to run for a few weeks, probably on a capacity basis, that's going to get really, really expensive. Very, very expensive. So I'm surprised I'm not hearing more on the demand side, and both in terms of efficiency and demand response. And you're kind of treating DERs as sort of like a demand side thing too. So I'd like to hear more about integration into planning. And then the other thing, just an observation, is the levels of uncertainty here are pretty enormous. Hearing discussion of hydrogen industries which may or may not come into existence, and building systems around them. And I just leave the question on the table is how, from a planning perspective, do you deal with that kind of level of uncertainty, given the cost implications of the overbuild problem? Thank you.
Sure. So I guess I kind of view DERs in that same vein of technologies that will help us solve, like on my slide, I guess I broke down that winter problem into like the seasonal issue and then the peak issue. So DERs will help us solve that peak issue, but not the seasonal issue. Traditionally, well, the way I'm thinking about DERs anyway is about daily management of load, not about seasonal shifts. And so we have a lot of technologies today that can do the same thing. So, DERs to me are really competing with things like batteries, in their ability to kind of change the load shape and shift load, things like that. So that's where I kind of equate those two is in that and helping solve that problem.
I will start by immediately agreeing with you that I think if we're going to solve this and go to net zero, you need a lot more flexibility on the demand side. No question, because we're not getting it anywhere else. There's no other resources to buy that give us the flexibility, right? Like you look at a solution which has wind and storage, let's say, there's some flexibility there, but to get the ultimate flexibility that you need, I've looked into this in detail, it's huge, huge overbuild, very expensive. But adding some flexibility on the demand side reduces the amount of overbuild you need immensely. So I agree with you totally. Why are we not looking into it? I can only model things that I know, right? Like I can't make up a policy myself. I can't just come up with, I think that this is how the demand should participate, and then model that, right? Like that would be kind of meaningless if I went out with that. I think to the extent that we have things that we can model, we do it. I think I'd like the demand side community to talk to me more. Absolutely. And I think somebody brought up VPPs as well. These are all very difficult problems that I think do need to get addressed. VPPs being like aggregations of consumers and trying to have them participate as a single entity that are aggregated. It presents a lot of issues in terms of localized coordination. But in any event, all of this, I would say, is because of lack of just discussion in that area. And I would recommend it. I would recommend bringing more to us solutions that we can actually model.
Maybe one last thing. Relating to energy efficiency. Any energy efficiency must be done, period. It's probably the focus of our background that is more looking at electricity, the flexibility that is needed, the demand response and things like that. But I don't think, I suppose you all agree that energy efficiency must be there for sure and as much as possible.
I should also say, yeah, we absolutely have a large energy efficiency program that is baked into our demand forecast. And you also had a question about the uncertainty of the demand. I don't think we have time to get into that, but let's chat after.
Yeah, in the interest of efficiency and timeliness, please join me in thanking your first panel.